Let's look at question 8 first, and it says here, for each team, calculate store in field E and display the team rating. This is determined as follows, and then it says here a select case statement must be used. So here you're not really given a choice. If this particular part of the sentence were left out, then you are welcome to freely use either an if statement or a select case, whichever fits you or whichever suits you more. But in the semester test, remember that you should try and practice both options so that if you do get either option, you can easily answer the question as whatever suits you better. Okay, and then here you can see that we've got a table, and the table is important in the sense that you need to look at the headings at the top, because the headings at the top tell you what are the values you're going to have to use in order to work out the answer. So the answer will be, so you're taking the values, the stipend of the best athlete divided by the team score. So you know that well, the stipend of the best athlete, that already shows you that you need to use the best athlete index to access the stipend of that one particular athlete for that team, and you must divide it by the team score, which we had calculated in question 7. And so you need to take that, divide by that, and this will give you a double value. And according to this table, this double value could be a negative value. It could be a value that's in between. So in other words, a 0 value to, and then just under to 500, because if you look at this question properly, it says if it's a negative value, then the value should be C. If it is more than 500, it is a B. But if it's in between, so in between the negative value and anything that is not more than 500, you should get the value A. And you can see the team rating will then be either C, A, or B, which in other words means it is actually a string. And so now you note the one thing you also need to, I'm going to pause at this point and just ask you all, is for each and every single one of these questions, a very important aspect that you need to consider is how many answers are you working out. Now, why is this important? Because if you want to calculate something and you see that it has multiple answers, then it means that the answer should be displayed in a UJ grid. But if it is a single answer, then it should only be displayed in something like a text box. Now, in your semester test this Friday, which is just in 2 days' time, you need to, how do you determine if something has multiple answers or not? Well, throughout the semester test, we have been looking at how do you determine so, and we'll notice that for question, let's say, okay, question 3 was just about input, question 4 was writing a subroutine, but for question 5, you'll notice that it said calculate, store, and display the medal score of each athlete on each team. So the fact that you see that you had to calculate a medal score for every athlete, for every team, means that there are multiple answers. And then here for question 6, it says for each team, and then you notice that there's multiple answers. Question 7, again, for each team, again, multiple answers. What is important also is that you realize that for question 5, it was each athlete, each team. And so if we go to question 5's code, you'll notice that because it's each athlete, each team, the code occurs inside 2 for loops, one for athlete and one for team. Whereas if you look at question 6 was just for each team. Question 7 is also for each team. And so it is not a coincidence that you're picking up that, wait, there is a for T loop as well as a for T loop here before you start writing the code. And we know that with question 8, we will also have to have a for T loop, because the question 8 says for each team. So in other words, there's multiple answers. Every team must have its own team rating. And so over here, I'm going to have dim t as integer. And notice that I'm not using an A loop for every athlete, because I'm not interested in every athlete's whatever. I only need to look at the team. So we go for T is equal to 1 to n teams. We have a next T. And inside there, because we need to use a select case that checks the stipend of the best athlete, divided by the team score, I'm going to go and do this in a step-by-step manner. So in other words, I'm going to calculate the stipend of the best athlete divided by the team score before I pass this to the select case. Can you do all of this in one line of code? Sure, you can. But if you are looking at debugging your code and making sure that you are writing your code correctly and nothing goes wrong, my suggestion to you is rather to go the slow approach and write out your code in such a way that each line of code focuses on one particular operation. So in our case, we would like to work out this ratio first before we use it for comparison. And for some of you who know what's going on and you go, no, I don't need to write so many lines of code, that is your choice. It really boils down to you writing your code in a manner that suits you in terms of debugging your code should anything go wrong. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a ratio as double, okay, and this ratio is going to store the calculation of the stipend of the best athlete. Now, we know to get the stipend of any athlete, we do so by going sports t dot athletes, and then here we would normally put a value there, an index to indicate which athlete dot stipend. Okay, but the question now is what athlete, which athlete are we actually interested in? Is it every single athlete? No, we're just interested in one athlete for the current team, and that happens to be the athlete who is the best athlete. That is why we have the stipend of the best athlete divided by the team score. So over here, inside the brackets for athletes, where we have to specify which athlete, we're going to use sports t and then dot best athlete, because the best athlete field of the current sports is the location of where the best athlete actually is. Now, once we've got this value, we will need to divide it by the team score. As you can see, the team score, which we have worked out in the previous answer. So over here, I'm going to go sports t dot score. And that is now the answer. Ratio now contains the answer for this top item here. And now we can write our select case, which will then determine, based on the value we've just calculated, is it negative, is it in between, is it more than 500, and give the appropriate CAB string. So let's go. We say select case ratio. Now, of course, for those of you who don't want to write it the way I have, you could simply take this piece of code here, as is, copy it, and replace the ratio with that single line of code. It's really up to you. So my first case is I'm going to go case is less than 0, which means it is a negative value. And if this is the case, it will be sports t dot rating is equal to C. If it is not the case, if the case is actually case is greater than, and I believe the answer is greater than 500. So I'm going to go 500. And the reason why I'm doing it in this order is because I'm choosing to handle all negative values. I'm going to choose to handle all the values that are greater than 500, so that everything that is still remains, that would be the values that are in between there. And so I would say sports t dot rating is equal to B. And then finally, I'm going to be allowed to use case else in this particular situation. Sports t dot rating is equal to A. Now, this only works, ladies and gentlemen. We're only allowed to use else if, and this is important, you realize that you've got a negative value. In other words, on a number line, all the negative values have been handled, and all the values that are greater than 500 have also been handled. So you have an in-between. Then you can use else. But if it was a negative value in between, and then it says 500 to 1,000, then you cannot do the case else. All right, because if you use the case else, then what happens is if your answer is 1,001, you would also get the value A. Does everyone understand the problem? If your condition here is not more than 500, it's actually more than 500, but only up to 1,000. Then you've got a upper limit on what the value of B can be. All right, so once that is done, can't you say 0 to 500? Case of L. Yeah, you could also then, if it was case is greater than 500 to 1,000, and then in here, instead of using case else, I would say case is 0 to 500 because, well, I would say case is less than 5. Yes, good. Well, the thing is, if you say 0 to 500, what happens if it is, well, yeah, okay, you can use cases 0 to 500 because yes, it would handle that because it would consider 500. This is anything more than 500. Okay, all right, good point. Then obviously once you've done that, you would have to do the display, and so we would display T and N athletes plus 3, and then C string. Well, you don't use C string because sports rating is already a string, and so that is the code for writing question 8. All right, but try and do the same question using an if statement, and try to consider what will happen if your values are actually different. So if it's closed off from the negative side, so in other words, let's say the value is minus 500 to 0, and then as I said, this would be 0 greater than, well, 500 to, so if let's change the scenario here of this question, and let's make it, let me just go and put in comment there. So let's change these conditions here so that it is actually minus 500 to less than 0, and then there's the in between there, and then this last one here is 500 to 1,001. Okay, so if you had such a situation, how would you modify the select case to handle it for this particular scenario instead? And this is something I would suggest that you take a look at, because on Friday semester test, obviously you're getting something similar here. If we were ready to break down the semester test for you, you're going to be asked the following. Number 1, you're going to be asked to define record structures. Number 2, you'll be asked to initialize those arrays and set up the grid and label them. Number 3, you'll be asked to input the information. There will be a question asking you to total something or average something. You'll be asked to find a maximum or find a minimum. And then the other thing that you also have to do would be what we are doing here, which is you're going to have a selection problem. So so we'll give you a number of ranges, and we'll say if it's this condition, give us A. If it's this condition, give us B, or something along those lines. So that's really all we're testing you in the semester test this Friday. And so if you want to get better experience at this, make sure, number 1, you're able to do it using a select case or an if statement, and you must be able to handle any range of values like this one, which is really easy because it's everything before a certain value and it's everything after a certain value. But now, what if we were to close it off and limit it and say, no, it's actually from minus 500 all the way to 1,001. And Emmy Sekus and I saying, well, if I say case less than 500 for A, well, if you say case less than 500, then for A, that is going to be a bit more, well, in this case, then it is fine, because notice that I changed it to 500 to 1,001. But what if it was, let's say, more than 500 to 1,001? Okay. Then you see the problem is if you say less than 500, that will still be fine. But if it was more than 500, how would you then change your code? So you would also have to now take into consideration that this is you have to have your greater than, equal to, less than, equal to. All of those things will have to play a role in your particular question. All right, so that is question 8, and I'm going to leave you to play around with the variations. I mean, on the original cases. Okay, so on the original cases, you say, what if you say less than 500 for A? Well, if you said case is less than 500, oh, right. If you say less than 500, let's consider this. It is more than 500. So let look at this. It is more than 500, and then the negative value in between and more than 5. So where would you say less than 500? Would you keep it here? Would you say over here case is less than 500? Is that what you are suggesting for our original question? Yes, you may ask your question.
Yes, Prof. Like instead of saying case else, I would say case less than 500 for A, and then for B it's the same as cases greater than 500 is fine.
So you would say for B is
Greater, and
greater
then
than.
for A
Okay.
lesser.
Okay, so you say B case is B for B, case is greater than 500, and then for the last one you would say case is less than 500. Is that what you're
Yes.
saying? Is there? Okay. The one problem with your answer here is that if you take a look at this question, again, never mind question 9. What about 500? Would that be included now?
No. Wait, which one? The second one
For
or the
A.
first one?
Well, original one. Let's take this point. Negative value. Okay, so case is less than 0. That's fine. It's there. All right. Then you say in
Yes.
between. In between would be A, but now we are handling the B first. So here I've got cases greater than 500, which is correct. More than 500. That's what we're trying to do. More than 500. That's B. But now we need to do A, which is in between. And you said that you would say less than 500 for A. So that's what I've done. Case is less than 500 for A. And would that be correct for handling all your situation in the original cases?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
Maybe
But
perhaps say less or equals
okay.
to 500.
Yeah, so if I have 500, where will I get a C, B, or A answer?
Yeah.
No, we won't. You won't. Okay, RJ Zeta is now like intercepting and saying, would it be more correct if we say less than equal to? Okay, and RJ Zeta, I know you've got the answer, but you must make sure that you say very carefully what. Okay, and LKM Malinga is going, no, man, you should just go cases 0 to 500. Okay, look, you must understand that when we work with case statements or if statements, there are many ways to answer this. So if you had said case 0 to 500, would this also work? Any ideas?
Yes.
Yeah, it would have worked. But that's not to say your answer is wrong. You see, RJ Zeta said, wouldn't they say is less than equal to 500? Would that also work?
Yes, it would.
Yes, it would. So what we're trying to get at is there's many variations. And it boils down to you using the one that you are most comfortable with. But keep in mind that when you write things like this, make sure you have test data that tests each of these conditions correctly. Because if I just said, oh no, I'm just going to throw some random values and it's always going to give me C, I will never check and test if this is written correctly. Whereas now I can see, well, if I've got the answer for 500, is it going to give me A? Because if I look at this table, you reading it as a human, you can pick up that the value 500 should give you A. And if I gave you the value 250, it should also give you A. But if we gave you 750, then it should give you B. And if it was a minus something, it should give you a C. So the idea is you know that there's three possibilities. And when you test your program using test data, you need to, when you're looking at this code, you must go, look, I don't care what the value is there. I'm going to reverse engineer it, if I can put it that way. I'm going to work out values that will give me an answer that will give me a potential value that will give me a C, will give me a value for B, and give me a value in A. And then I'm going to test my code. Whether you're handwriting it or writing it out in Visual Studio, you would then say, okay, if it's 500, let's try this select case. 500, is it less than 0? No. Is it greater than 500? No. Is the case less than equal to 500? Yes. I'll get a BA. That is correct. Okay. And then case Lichman saying, but less than equal to 500 could also include the negative values because you're not specifying the limits. Now, we are actually talking about the original condition here, which is the reason why we are going to be okay, all right? Because as RJ Zeta has mentioned, it won't be the case for negative values because it has been handled already. Remember, the way a select case works is, well, T. Cutler is also like, yeah, that's right. The first case statement would have handled the negative values. Okay, so just remember that when it comes to select cases, the first match gets executed and then you exit the entire select case. So if it had been a negative value already, if it had been a -5, it would have been caught by the first case statement. It would have executed the code in the first case statement, and then it would have exited the end select, and it would not have handled the rest of the other cases. Okay, so just keep that in mind, which is the reason why order is very important. And so if I had taken this line of code and I had put it here first, then this would be wrong. Because as K.S. Luchman is suggesting, then if I have a -5, this will not work. All right, Jal Mabas is saying, Prof, are we allowed to put two conditions within one case statement? Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but I think what you mean is, so you have a select case something ratio and ratio 2, possibly. It doesn't quite work that way, because remember, the way a select case works is it says, give us one condition, and then we are going to compare that one condition against these several cases. What you possibly are thinking of is that some of the past papers you've seen, you've been asked to use if statements as well as select cases, in which case then, yeah, I'm trying to be punny here, you are then writing two separate select statements, but they are split up by an if statement. I can show you an example of that after I go through K.S. Lichman's original question. All right, so let's try that instead. Okay, so let's just wrap up question 8. This is basically question 8. However, try and answer the same question using these 3 new conditions instead, keeping in mind, remember the rules, and that is your order of which your case statements appear is very important. Okay, number 1, because whichever is processed first gets to handle that, and then the rest of the cases are ignored because you already dealt with that case. And so if it had been a negative value, then it might have been a negative value for this as well, but it would not have been sorted by A because C would have been assigned already, and then they would have exited the select case statement. All right, so that's one thing. Number 2, be wary of whether you leave your conditions open or not. What we mean by that is this is a nice question in the sense that you've got a negative value, so everything negative, on the negative side of the number line, and then everything positive on the number line, so there's no bounds. And so this is easy. You could even use case else here. Okay, this also works, but you can also use case else. But if you now have conditions where you close it off, you've got a minus 500 to 1001, that require you definitely cannot use case. Do not use case if you see that there is a upper limit or a lower limit on either side. Okay, yes, J.L. Mabaso, would you like to ask your question?
Ma'am, regarding the fact that there could be a second condition like negative 50, like negative 50 to less than 0. Can we use an if statement within each case?
No, the idea is not to use, it's because you see, you're talking about a negative 50 to 0. If it was a negative 50 to 0, you would actually have to write it as it's still being compared to the ratio. We're still looking at, is ratio a value negative 50 to 0? So in that case, if it was negative 50 to 0, I would say then you would have a case is less than negative 50, right? But then afterwards, you would have a case is less than 0 or something along those lines. So it wouldn't be an if statement in that sense. I sense what you were trying to do is you're saying that, yes, case is less than 0, but you must also have but if we're looking at this ratio, we're going to look at the ratio again because we've caught that it is less than 0, but we need to also check if the ratio is, greater than equal to negative 50, then, so that doesn't quite make sense. Because it is still comparing ratio, you should rather write a fourth case statement for that problem. Okay. All right. So,
thank you,